In a lot of ways, the sports card space is a bit of a wild, wild west. It's a space that has managed to position itself near but not quite in realms that have a lot more regulation, but exists just far enough away as oftentimes to be able to keep its skeletons hidden in the closet. Even though I'm not an advocate for regulating this industry, one of the unfortunate results of this unregulated reality, when combined with the vast amounts of money some of these cards can be worth, is it can be a space ripe for scammers to take advantage of the unsuspecting. And beyond that, even when scammers are caught red-handed, more often than not, they receive no real consequences for their actions beyond a slap on the wrist, or maybe they lose their social media accounts and following, or their eBay stores, or something minor like this. So when there is an actual story of someone facing actual consequences for their scamming, it is noteworthy. In this video, we'll look at a story of an autograph forger who is facing the consequences of his scamming. The main parts of this story I'm about to share actually happened quite a while back, in 2015 to 2017, though the consequences of his actions didn't catch up until quite a number of years later. Between 2015 and 2017, Cord Monroe, who also goes by the alias David Scott, bought 14 different unsigned T206 cards. The T206 cards are one of the most well-known and iconic sets of sports cards ever produced, home to one of the most valuable sports cards ever sold, as well as quite a few others that are iconic in their own right. The set as a whole is considered to be among the most sought of all vintage baseball card sets. Just as an interesting side note here on the alias he chose to go by, David Scott. I don't know why he chose that name. I mean, I'm not surprised he would try to hide his true identity, but if you Google the name David Scott, you can find that there is a former art professor at UCLA who wrote a book about how to do art restoration without turning it into art forgery. So I just kind of think it's hilarious that this forger's alias name is the same as an expert in the field of art forgery. The 14 cards he bought were all genuine copies of these cards. None of them were the most iconic players from that set. So none of the cards are super cheap from this set, but the least iconic players are not necessarily that expensive. Once he got the cards, he would then sign the cards, or I don't know, maybe hire somebody to sign the cards, I'm not sure. And seemingly he must have done a pretty good job on these forged autographs, because supposedly he was even able to submit some of them to several third-party grading companies, and they passed their authentication processes. I couldn't confirm this part, but several different threads about this topic made claims that 4 of the largest authentication grading companies there are all encapsulated at least one or more of these as authentic autographs. He then resold these cards on 2 different auction sites for thousands of dollars. He sold 2 T206 Eddie Sakate cards, one for $12,925, one for $1,250. He sold a lot of Knapp Rucker, Billy Sullivan, Wid Conroy, and Fred Parent cards for $26,415. He sold a smaller lot with Frank Baker and Jesse Tannehill cards for $18,810. He sold cards of Red Murray, Bob Rhodes, and Heine Zimmerman, each for over $5,000 a piece. He sold Elmer Flick, Fred Snodgrass, and Patty Livington cards. Adding up the numbers of the 11 of the 14 that we do have numbers for, this equals a total of $74,400 in total sales, and those last 3 were supposedly among the cheaper of the bunch, so maybe we can estimate the total amount he received was something around $77,000. Now we're going to come back to this number a little bit later in the story, because I do think there is something worth mentioning about it when we come to see what his eventual consequence came to be. Selling these 14 cards, maybe more, who knows, over a 3-year span and not getting caught, I can only imagine this fellow had assumed he had gotten away with his fraud, but that wouldn't be the case. In late 2018, a user on the Net54 Vintage Card Forum had come to discover a card that was sold on eBay twice, once without a signature and once with a signature. It was recognized to be the same card by having the exact same imperfections in the exact same spots, a fingerprint of sorts for that specific card. Once this discovery was made, the diligent users of the Net54 forum went to work trying to find other cards that had been sold on eBay that were also fake, and that is when these 14 fake autographs were discovered. Once the evidence was gathered, it was brought to the authorities, who conducted their own investigation and eventually came to the point of discovering the culprit behind these 14 fake T206 autographs. Now, there's a couple of things about this that are kind of like, wait, the forger was that stupid kind of realizations. Many of these cards were bought on eBay and sold on eBay. Previous sales are very trackable. It's very easy to look at pictures of past cards, so the fact that many of these were bought and sold on the same platform is kind of ridiculous. It's actually not that hard hard to hunt that evidence down. That's a pretty level 1 crook mistake if you ask me. So as could be expected, it wasn't hard to track down the history of the lines of ownership for these cards. And when the authorities knew what they were looking for, it wasn't hard to look through the previous sales in other auction websites either to find some of them sold elsewhere, not just on eBay. Now at this point, it should be mentioned that this could have gone really bad really fast for the scammer. His card sales were crossing state lines, making this a federal case, not just a local case. There were several different types of charges that could potentially be attached to this. The potential for severe consequences was there. However, at the same time, this level of fraud is not high on the FBI's agenda. A $77,000 fraud case is definitely something, but it isn't something they want to waste a lot of resources on when there are much bigger fish in the sea to hunt down. So while the potential for high consequences was real, the reality of the consequence was actually pretty minor. The crook was ordered to pay $73,358 in restitution and be on probation for 5 years. Now keep in mind that he sold the cards for something like $77,000 originally, so this essentially meant he was just paying back what he had already stole, maybe even a little less than he had already stole, and then just have 5 years of probation. Actually, I would suggest nothing too significant really, considering what this was. The money was used to reimburse the original buyers, who had by this point gone several years with just losing that money and having no idea if they were ever going to get it back again. Keep in mind, some of these were $25,000 purchases that the person just was out $25,000 for this long of a time. It's hard for me to imagine many other spaces where thievery of that amount would have resulted in basically just a couple of years probation. I can't imagine someone stealing a couple of cars, say, selling them for 75 grand, and then once caught, just having to pay the money back they had received from selling the cards and maybe getting a couple years probation. That would be ridiculous. The unregulated reality of the sports card industry makes it a playing field quite wide open for the nefarious to play in, if they are so inclined. And it's for this reason that you, as a buyer of sports cards, have to be extra vigilant when buying sports cards. There's a couple of lessons for the sports card buyer that come up from this, but I think the biggest one of all is this. You can't just automatically trust grading authentication. This story highlights how easily forgeries can slip through the cracks, and with the amount of grading just continuing to rise in recent months and years, the easier it is for fakes to slip through the cracks. And on top of that, the possibility of actual forged slabs themselves that look incredibly realistic, you have to really go into some purchases with eyes wide open, scanning for scams. If you're in the lower end realm of sports cards, this probably isn't something you have to deal with. But if you're in the big money spaces, this is something to keep a super close eye on. The other big lesson I get from this is the importance of strong networks of hobbyists supporting each other and watching each other's backs. The scammer would have never even been discovered had it not been for the efforts of the Net54 forum users. If the hobby is to remain a pretty much unregulated space, it makes it extra important for us to be on the lookout for nefarious actors and to help bring awareness to each other. There is no authority who's going to do that for us. This doesn't and shouldn't be the only thing we look for in the hobby, or else a lot of people stop listening if it's a constant stream of the tinfoil hat brigade and unsubstantiated finger pointing, but it is something that we need to be on the lookout for and ready to share with each other and support each other about. As long as the sports card space remains relatively free from regulation, and as long as scammers who are caught have really very minimal consequences, the sports card space will likely continue to be a playpen for crooks and fraudsters. So watch yourselves out there and look out for your fellow hobbyists. Build those community connections and spread that knowledge. I'd say that's really the best way to create an environment that doesn't lend itself well to scammers scamming.